The HFY had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, they had never known defeat or felt the sting of humiliation from a lesser species. They were tall creatures with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed with a cold amber light, and they moved through the galaxy as if they owned every star and every world that orbited them. When their expansion fleets discovered the 17 human colonies scattered across the edge of explored space, they did not send diplomats or ask questions or offer treaties. They simply decided that these worlds now belonged to them and that the soft pink creatures living on them would make excellent workers for their mines and factories. Admiral HFY stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the first human world burn beneath him, and he felt nothing but mild satisfaction at how easy this was going to be. The human defense fleet had been brave, and he would give them that much credit, but bravery meant nothing against ships that were 10 times larger and carried weapons that had been perfected over millennia. Human fighters exploded like tiny fireworks against the void, and their larger vessels cracked open under the sustained fire of HFY plasma cannons, and within 6 hours, the orbital defense grid around the colony world of New Geneva had been reduced to floating debris. The ground invasion was even simpler because the HFY did not bother with soldiers or careful tactics, and instead they simply used neurosuppression bombs that knocked every human unconscious within seconds of detonation. When the humans woke up, they found cold metal collars locked around their necks, and these collars would become their new masters, because a single command from any HFY could send waves of agony through every nerve in their bodies. 17 worlds fell in 3 standard months, and the HFY processed 4 billion humans into their labor caste with the same cold efficiency that they had used on 100 other species before. Families were separated without mercy or consideration because the HFY did not care about such things, and children were torn from their parents, and husbands from wives, and siblings from each other. The humans were loaded onto massive transport ships and scattered across HFY space to work in places where no HFY would ever set foot because the work was too dangerous or too dirty or simply beneath their dignity. Young Marcus Chen, who had been a teacher on the colony of Horizon's Edge, found himself working in a radioactive engine room of a warship where the heat and radiation would slowly kill him over the next decade. Sarah Okonkwo, who had been a doctor, was sent to a mining facility on a frozen moon where she treated the injuries of slaves who were worked until their bodies simply gave out. Old grandfather Yuki Tanaka, who had survived 90 years of life and seen the birth of human interstellar civilization, watched his grandchildren dragged away to different ships and knew he would never see them again. Earth received a single transmission from the dying colonies before all communication was cut off, and it contained coordinates of every world that had been taken and the names of every human who had been captured and processed. The message ended with 3 simple words that would be carved into monuments and whispered in prayers for the next 30 years. Remember, U.S. always. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss the HFY expansion into human territory, and representatives from 200 species listened to the reports with expressions ranging from concern to boredom to quiet satisfaction. Ambassador Trellix of the Unified Worlds rose to speak, and his 4 eyes blinked slowly as he delivered what he clearly believed was a sympathetic statement. The Council formally condemns the actions of the HFY hegemony and expresses deep concern for the welfare of the human population, and we call upon the hegemony to consider more humanitarian treatment of their new labor acquisition. The HFY representative did not even bother to respond and simply sat in silence with what might have been amusement flickering in his amber eyes. No sanctions were proposed because the HFY controlled too many critical trade routes, and no military action was considered because no species wanted to risk their own people for a race that most of them had barely heard of. Humanity was too young and too small and too weak to matter in the great game of galactic politics, and the Council had decided long ago that the strong did what they wished and the weak suffered what they must. Earth's remaining ambassador stood alone in the great chamber and looked at the faces of 200 species who had just decided that 4 billion of her people were not worth fighting for. She did not rage or weep or beg, because she understood now what the galaxy truly was and what her people would need to become. If they were ever going to see their lost children again, she simply gathered her things and walked out of the chamber without another word, and behind her the Council moved on to discussing trade disputes and border negotiations as if nothing of importance had happened. The human fleets that had survived the initial assault pulled back to the Sol system and took up defensive positions around Earth and Mars in the outer colonies, and they waited for an invasion that never came. The Kethvari had what they wanted and saw no reason to waste resources conquering a single system when they had already taken everything of value. Earth went quiet, and its communications with the wider galaxy dropped to almost nothing, and its representatives withdrew from every forum and organization that would have them. Other species assumed that humanity was mourning their dead and accepting their new place in the galactic order, and some even praised them for showing wisdom and maturity in the face of inevitable defeat. The Kethvari certainly gave no more thought to the matter, because enslaved species always broke eventually, and humans would be no different from any of the others. But deep beneath the surface of Earth, and hidden in facilities carved into asteroids and moons, something was happening that the galaxy could not see and would not understand until it was far too late. In a bunker 3 kilometers below the Rocky Mountains, a council of human leaders gathered around a table and looked at each other with eyes that held no tears and no despair, only cold and patient fury. General Wei Chun, who had lost 2 daughters in the fall, spoke first, and her voice was steady as stone. 30 years is what our scientists say they need, and 30 years is what we will give them, and when that time is up, we will go and get our people back. And if the galaxy tries to stop us, then the galaxy will learn what happens when you take something from humanity and expect us to simply accept it. The others nodded, and in that moment, a plan was born that would shake the foundations of civilizations that had stood for 10,000 years. For 30 years, the galaxy heard almost nothing from Earth, and most species simply forgot that humanity existed at all. The Kethvari certainly gave no thought to the small blue world at the edge of explored space, because they had already taken everything they wanted, and the slaves they had acquired were performing exactly as expected. But what the galaxy did not see was the greatest transformation any species had ever undertaken in such a short span of time beneath the surface of Earth. A network of research facilities spread like roots through the bedrock, and in these hidden places, the brightest minds humanity had ever produced worked without rest on a single goal. They would build a force capable of challenging the Kethvari, and they would bring their people home no matter what it cost. Dr. Elena Vasquez was one of the lead scientists on what they called Project Prometheus, and she had been working 18-hour days for 15 years without complaint because her husband and 3 children were somewhere out there wearing collars around their necks. She stood before a holographic display showing a captured Kethvari fighter and pointed to the engine assembly with hands that trembled slightly from too much coffee and too little sleep. Their faster-than-light technology is based on principles we theorized decades ago, but never developed, and now that we have working examples, we can not only match them but exceed them. Admiral Chun nodded from across the room, and her silver hair had gone completely white in the years since the fall, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. How long until we can build our own ships using these principles? Elena pulled up another display showing a sleek vessel that looked nothing like anything the galaxy had ever seen before. We already have, and the prototype completed its first test flight last month, and it performed beyond our most optimistic projections. The ship was called the Whisper, and it was the first of a new class of vessels that could move faster and strike harder than anything the HFY had ever built. But ships alone would not be enough to free 4 billion people scattered across thousands of worlds, and so humanity had developed something else. They called it the Prometheus Network, and it was an artificial intelligence system unlike anything that had existed before. And it was spread across 10,000 hidden nodes throughout human space. The network had one purpose and one purpose only. It would find every enslaved human in the galaxy, and when the time came, it would help coordinate the largest liberation operation in history. Dr. James Okafor was the lead architect of the network, and he explained its capabilities to the War Council with quiet pride. We have been seeding listening devices throughout HFY space for the past 20 years using automated probes that are too small to detect. And we now know the location of approximately 97% of our enslaved population. He brought up a map of the galaxy with billions of tiny dots representing human slaves scattered across HFY territory. More importantly, we have developed a way to disable the neural compliance collars remotely using a specific frequency pulse that will overload their control circuits. Admiral Chun leaned forward with sudden intensity. You mean we can free them all at once? Every caller in range of our signal network will unlock simultaneously, and our people will be free to fight or flee as the situation requires. The room was silent for a long moment as the implications sank in. Meanwhile, among the enslaved humans, something else was growing in the shadows of their captivity. Kira Vasquez was only 5 years old when her colony fell, and she had grown up in the engine rooms of HFY warships, learning to work with radiation and heat that would kill most species within hours. But she had also learned other things in whispered conversations with other slaves and encoded messages tapped out on metal pipes, and in brief moments of contact during shift changes. She had learned that Earth had not forgotten them, and that a day was coming when the collars would fall silent and the ships would come. They called it the Promise, and it spread through the slave population like a secret fire that no amount of HFY surveillance could detect. Resistance cells formed in the most unlikely places, and slaves who had seemed completely broken learned to hide their true thoughts behind masks of obedience while they memorized the layouts of ships and facilities and defense systems. Old grandfather Yuki Tanaka had survived 25 years of slavery through sheer stubborn refusal to die, and he had become a legend among the slave population as the keeper of names. He had memorized the name and location of every slave he had ever met, and he passed this information along through networks that the HFY never suspected existed, and eventually this information found its way back to Earth through channels that would have seemed like magic to anyone who did not understand human determination. The HFY noticed none of this because they had owned slaves for 12,000 years, and they knew exactly how broken species behaved. They watched for obvious signs of rebellion, like violence or sabotage, and they punished any hint of disobedience with pain that would shatter most minds. But they did not watch for hope, because they did not believe that slaves could feel such a thing after enough time had passed. This was their greatest mistake. On Earth, the shipyards hidden behind Jupiter's moons worked around the clock, building vessels that would have made the HFY fleet look like children's toys. 17 fleets were taking shape in the darkness of space, and each fleet was named for one of the fallen colonies and crewed by volunteers who had lost family in the fall. The flagship of the combined force was called the Remembrance, and it was 3 kilometers of black metal and revolutionary technology and barely contained fury. Captain David Okonkwo stood on its bridge during final testing and watched as the ship executed maneuvers that should have been impossible for a vessel of its size. His mother Sarah had been taken 30 years ago, and the last message she had managed to send said only that she was alive and that she was waiting. He intended to find her on the 30th anniversary of the fall, Kira Vasquez stood in the engine room of a HFY battleship and felt her collar vibrate in a pattern she had been taught to recognize since childhood. It was a message sent through the Prometheus network using frequencies. The HFY had never thought to monitor 3 days and then be ready to run. She looked around at the other human slaves working beside her and saw the same barely hidden excitement in their eyes, because they had all received the same message. After 30 years of darkness and pain and waiting, the promise was about to be fulfilled. High Regent Verketh was hosting a grand celebration on the capital world of Kethfor, primed to mark the 30th anniversary of what his people called the pacification of the human territories. The Great Hall was filled with the most powerful members of HFY society, and they drank rare wines and ate delicacies prepared by human slaves, who moved silently between the tables with their eyes cast down. Verketh raised his glass, and his amber eyes glowed with satisfaction as he prepared to deliver a speech about the eternal strength of the hegemony. He never got the chance to speak a single word. Every alarm in the palace began screaming at once, and the lights flickered, and the floor shook with what felt like a distant explosion. A military aide rushed into the hall, with panic written across his obsidian features. "High Regent, we are under attack, and our fleets are reporting enemy contacts at 17 different locations simultaneously." Verketh felt something cold settle in his chest, because no species had ever attacked the hegemony on such a scale. "Who dare strike at us?" The aide's voice trembled as he answered. "The humans, High Regent, and they have ships we have never seen before across HFY Space 17. Human fleets emerged from slipspace at the exact same moment in perfect coordination that should have been impossible. Each fleet appeared at a strategic location chosen for maximum impact, and their targets included shipyards and supply depots and communication hubs and the worlds where the largest concentrations of human slaves were held." Admiral Wei Chun stood on the bridge of the Remembrance and watched as her tactical display lit up with enemy contacts. "All fleets report successful emergence and commence Operation Homecoming." The HFY Defense Forces responded with the speed and discipline of a military that had dominated the galaxy for millennia, and within minutes they had organized counterattacks at every engagement point. But something was wrong. Their ships were slower than the human vessels by a significant margin, and their weapons seemed to have difficulty tracking targets that moved with impossible agility, and their communications were being jammed by signals that adapted faster than they could filter them out. On the HFY battleship where Kira Vasquez worked, the crew was rushing to battle stations when every neural compliance collar on the ship suddenly went dark. The familiar hum of the control circuit vanished, and for the first time in her adult life, Kira felt nothing pressing against her mind. She looked at the other slaves in the engine room and saw the same stunned realization spreading across their faces. "We are free." The words felt strange in her mouth after 30 years of forced silence. But there was no time to celebrate, because they had prepared for this moment, and everyone knew exactly what they needed to do. Kira moved to the primary power coupling and began entering commands that would redirect energy away from the weapon systems and toward the engines. "If we cannot fight, we can at least make sure this ship cannot fight either." Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on thousands of ships and facilities and worlds as 4 billion humans suddenly found themselves free of the collars that had controlled them for 3 decades. Some ran for escape pods and shuttles that had been secretly prepared for this moment, and others sabotaged the systems they had been forced to maintain, and others simply refused to work and let the HFY realize for the first time how dependent they had become on slave labor. The hegemony's military advantage began to crumble as ships lost power, and communication networks went dark, and defense grids failed to activate. Captain David Okonkwo led his squadron through the debris field of what had been a HFY shipyard, and felt grim satisfaction as he watched another enemy vessel break apart. Under concentrated fire, find the slave transports and disable them, but do not destroy, and we need those ships intact. The human fleets were not fighting to destroy the HFY military, although they were certainly accomplishing that as well. They were fighting to reach their people and bring them home, Admiral. Chun watched the battle unfold on her tactical display and felt 30 years of cold fury finally finding its release. Status report on civilian extraction, Commander Torres responded. From the operations station, with barely contained excitement, extraction teams have secured 17 major holding facilities, and we are loading survivors onto transport ships as we speak, and casualties are lighter than projected. Chun allowed herself a small moment of relief before turning back to the larger battle. What is the enemy response? The HFY are attempting to consolidate their remaining forces around their core worlds, and they have sent a request to the Galactic Council, demanding intervention against human aggression. Chun almost laughed at that because the same council that had watched 4 billion humans be enslaved, without lifting a finger, was now being asked to protect the slavers. Let them ask and see what answer they receive on HFY Prime High Regent. Verkith was receiving reports that made his blood run cold. A quarter of our fleet has been destroyed or disabled in the first 6 hours, and slave uprisings are reported on over 2,000 worlds. And our communication networks are compromised by some kind of adaptive interference. He slammed his fist against the command console. This is impossible because they were primitives with barely functional starships, and how did they build all of this without us knowing? No one had an answer because no one had been watching. The HFY had been so certain of their superiority that they had never considered the possibility that a conquered species might rise again, and they had certainly never imagined that the soft pink creatures they had enslaved might spend 30 years preparing for revenge. Verkith straightened his spine and forced himself to think clearly. We still have numerical superiority, and we still have resources they cannot match and order a full military mobilization and crush this rebellion before it spreads further. The HFY counter attack began with overwhelming force as reserve fleets were activated, and every available ship was sent to engage the human invaders. For a moment it seemed like the tide might turn because the HFY had thousands of years of military experience, and they were fighting in their own territory with full knowledge of every strategic advantage. Human ships began taking losses as the numerical superiority of the hegemony started to tell. Admiral Chun watched 3 of her cruisers disappear in balls of fire and felt the weight of every death settle on her shoulders. But she did not waver because she had known this would be costly, and she had accepted that price long ago. All fleets maintain pressure on primary objectives, and we did not come this far to stop. Now the battle raged across 1,000 light years of space, and the galaxy watched in stunned silence as a species they had dismissed as insignificant fought toe-to-toe with one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in existence. On the Galactic Council communication channels, representatives of 200 species argued about what to do. Some demanded intervention to restore order, and others suggested staying neutral, and a few quietly admitted that they were enjoying watching the HFY finally face consequences for their arrogance. Ambassador Trellix of the Unified Worlds listened to the debate and remembered the day 30 years ago when he had delivered his carefully worded condemnation that meant nothing. He had not expected to feel ashamed of that moment, but watching the humans fight for their enslaved people made him wonder what his own species might have done in the same situation. Nothing, probably. They would have done exactly what humanity was doing now. They would have waited and planned and built, and then they would have come back with fire in their eyes and fury in their hearts. The humans had a word for what they were doing. They called it remembering. The HFY counteroffensive was brutal and effective in ways that reminded the galaxy why the hegemony had dominated for 12,000 years. Fresh fleets poured out of reserve bases that had been hidden across their territory and experienced Admirals who had crushed 100 rebellions took command of the defense. Human losses mounted as ships that had seemed invincible began to fall under concentrated fire from enemies who had finally adapted to their tactics. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the Remembrance and watched her tactical display turn red with warnings. "We have lost the 4th Fleet's flagship, and the 7th is reporting critical damage, and enemy reinforcements are arriving faster than projected, Commander." Torres looked up from his station with concern in his eyes. "Admiral, we may need to consider a tactical withdrawal to consolidate our forces." Chen's jaw tightened, but she did not dismiss the suggestion, because a good commander listened to their officers even when the advice was hard to hear. "How many of our people have we extracted so far?" "Approximately 800 million, but there are still over 3 billion in Kethvari territory." "Then we are not done, and signal all fleets to maintain pressure. And we did not spend 30 years preparing for this moment only to abandon our people when things get difficult." The battle continued, and human fleets adapted and improvised and fought with a desperation that the Kethvari had never encountered before, because the humans were not fighting for territory or resources or political advantage. They were fighting for family on the mining moon, where Sarah Okonkwo had spent 30 years treating the injuries of slaves. She stood at the entrance to the main facility and watched human shuttles descend through the thin atmosphere. Her hands were shaking because she had stopped believing this day would ever come. A young officer stepped off the first shuttle and scanned the crowd of freed slaves until his eyes found her. "Dr. Okonkwo, and I am Captain David Okonkwo, and I've been looking for you for a very long time." Sarah could not speak, because she was looking at her son, who had been a child when she was taken, and who was now a man with silver at his temples and command insignia on his uniform. "David." He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and wrapped his arms around her. And for a long moment, neither of them could do anything but hold each other and weep. This scene repeated itself millions of times across Kethvari space as families that had been torn apart were finally reunited. But the war was not over. High Regent Virkith had gathered the largest fleet the hegemony had assembled in 1,000 years and positioned it in defense of Kethvar Prime. 400 warships formed a wall around the homeworld, and every defense platform was active, and every weapon was ready. No enemy had ever reached Kethvar Prime in all the centuries of hegemony rule, and Virkith intended to keep that record intact. Then a single ship appeared on long-range sensors. It was the Remembrance, and it had come alone. Virkith laughed when he received the report, because surely the humans were not foolish enough to send one ship against 400. Destroy it, and let this be the symbol of our victory. The Kethvari fleet moved to intercept and opened fire with everything they had. And then something impossible happened. The Remembrance did not fire back, and instead, it simply moved. It danced through the Kethvari formation like a leaf on the wind and dodged plasma bursts and missile salvos and kinetic rounds with movements that seemed to violate the laws of physics. No ship that large should have been able to maneuver like that, and yet it wove between enemy vessels without taking a single hit. The humans were broadcasting the battle on every frequency in the galaxy, and representatives of 200 species watched in stunned silence as one human ship made fools of the most powerful fleet in existence. "What is that thing?" Ambassador Trellix whispered to his aide, who had no answer. As the Remembrance danced, it began deploying objects from its hull, and thousands of small pods screamed through the Kethvari defensive perimeter and descended toward the planet below. Virkith realized with horror what was happening. They are landing troops, and all ground forces intercept, and do not let them reach the surface. But it was too late, because the pods were too fast and too numerous, and they slipped through the gaps in the defense grid like water through a net. Each pod carried a squad of human soldiers in powered armor that made them nearly unstoppable, and they landed in the capital city itself. Their mission was not conquest. There were human slaves on Kethvar, Prime who served as household servants and display pieces for wealthy HFY, and there were children who had been born into bondage and had never known freedom. The soldiers had come for them. Squad leader Marcus Chen, who had spent 10 years in the radioactive engine room of a warship before being rescued, now led his team through the streets of the HFY capital. His armor made him faster and stronger than any HFY soldier, and his weapons cut through resistance like it was nothing. Extraction point Alpha is secure, and we have 43 civilians ready for pickup. Similar reports came in from across the city as human teams located and secured every enslaved human on the planet. The HFY military tried to respond, but their forces were designed for fleet combat and orbital defense, and they had never prepared for an enemy that would land soldiers on their homeworld. Within 6 hours, the operation was complete. The Remembrance descended through the atmosphere and extended landing ramps and freed humans streamed aboard, while HFY ground forces could only watch helplessly when the last person was safely aboard. Admiral Chun stepped out onto the hull of her ship and looked up at the cameras that were broadcasting across the galaxy. We did not come here for revenge, and we did not come here to conquer, and we came for our people, and now we have them. She paused and let her words sink into the billions of beings who were watching. But hear this, and hear it well, and let it reach every corner of this galaxy. Any species and any empire and any power that holds a human being against their will has one standard year to release them. After that year, we will come for them too. And this is not a threat. This is a promise. The Remembrance rose back into space and accelerated past the HFY fleet, which had finally stopped firing because there seemed no point in continuing. Admiral Chun looked back at the enemy homeworld shrinking in the view screen. How many of their ships did we destroy today? None, Admiral, and we did not fire a single shot. A smile crossed her weathered face. Good. Because I wanted them to know that we could have, and that we chose not to, and that is a message. They will remember. Ambassador Trellix turned off the broadcast feed and sat in silence for a long moment. His aide finally spoke the question that was on everyone's mind. What are they? Trellix thought about the species that had been dismissed as primitives 30 years ago, and then thought about what they had just witnessed. They are what happens when you give a species a reason to hate you and then give them 30 years to prepare. He shook his head slowly, and I think we are all going to have to get used to living in their galaxy now. The Liberation War lasted 18 months, and when it finally ended, the galaxy was a very different place than it had been before. The HFY hegemony had not been destroyed because the humans had never wanted destruction, and instead they had been reduced to a shadow of their former power. Their territory was limited to the 7 original worlds they had inhabited before their expansion began, and their military was restricted to defensive forces only, and every human slave had been returned with full reparations paid. High Regent Verketh signed the surrender documents in the same great hall where he had once celebrated the anniversary of human subjugation, and the bitter irony was not lost on him. The humans had beaten his people without hatred or cruelty, and they had fought with precision and determination, and then they had stopped the moment their goals were achieved. That scared him more than anything else, because a species driven by rage would eventually burn itself out, but a species driven by cold purpose would never stop until they had exactly what they wanted. Across the galaxy, other powers were making rapid calculations about their own relationships with humanity. Species that had purchased human slaves from the HFY frantically released them, and corporations that had used human labor suddenly discovered that all their workers had been freed, and several minor empires that had been considering expansion into human space quietly abandoned those plans. The Prometheus network found them all, no matter how well hidden the records or how thoroughly destroyed the evidence. The humans always seemed to know exactly where their people were being held. The deadline passed, and a few species who had gambled that the humans were bluffing discovered their mistake when fleets appeared in their systems and delivered ultimatums that left no room for negotiation. Within 2 years of the war's end, every human in the galaxy was free. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss what they called the human situation, and representatives of 200 species gathered to debate their options. Some demanded that humanity be contained and restricted before they became a threat to galactic stability, and others argued for accommodation and alliance, and a few suggested that perhaps the existing order needed to change anyway. The debate went on for days with no resolution in sight. Then the human delegation arrived. Admiral Wei Chun walked into the great chamber wearing the simple uniform of the Liberation Fleet, and the room fell silent as she made her way to the speaking platform. She was 62 years old, and her hair was completely white, and her face bored lines of someone who had carried impossible burdens for most of her life. She had been a slave for 15 years before the uprising, and she still carried the scar where her collar had been. "You are afraid of us now." Her voice was calm and clear, and carried to every corner of the vast chamber. "Good, because fear is the only language some of you understand, and fear is what kept you silent when 4 billion of my people were taken, and fear is what made you look away while children were torn from their parents." She let the words hang in the air. "But we did not fight this war to become what we destroyed, and we did not spend 30 years preparing just so we could build our own empire on the bones of our enemies. We fought because no sentient being should ever be property, and not humans, and not anyone." She placed a data chip on the central podium. "This is the new compact, and it is a proposed amendment to Council law that would make slavery of any species for any reason grounds for immediate military intervention, not condemnation, and not sanctions, and not expressions of deep concern. Action." The chamber erupted in argument as species that had practiced slavery for millennia protested, and species that had suffered it demanded support, and moderate powers tried to find some middle ground. Admiral Chun waited for the noise to die down. "You can vote however you choose, and we will not force you to accept this compact. And that is not who we are. But know this, if you vote against it, and if you continue to allow slavery to exist in this galaxy, then we will enforce these principles ourselves, and we will do it without your permission, and without your approval. We have the capability, and we have proven that much already." She looked around the chamber at faces that ranged from hostile to thoughtful to quietly supportive. "Or you can join us, and we can build something better together. And we can create a galaxy where no child ever wakes up with a collar around their neck, and no family is ever torn apart for the profit of another species. The choice is yours." The vote took 3 days of intense negotiation and deal-making and arm-twisting. Species that had practiced slavery for millennia voted against the compact, and species that had suffered it voted for, and the moderates agonized over the implications of either choice. In the end, it passed by 4 votes. Ambassador Trellix cast the deciding vote, and when asked later why he had done so, he simply said that he was tired of being ashamed of his own silence. The new compact went into effect 1 year after the end of the Liberation War, and the galaxy began the long, slow process of dismantling systems of oppression that had existed since before. Humans learned to make fire. It was not easy, and it was not quick, and there were setbacks and compromises and moments when it seemed like the old order would reassert itself. But every time a species considered backsliding, they remembered what had happened to the Kethvari, and they remembered that humanity was watching on Earth in the plaza built over the ruins of the old United Nations building. A monument was unveiled on the 40th anniversary of the fall. It was a wall of black stone that would endure for millennia, and carved into its surface were the names of every human who had died in the colonies, and in the slave camps, and in the Liberation War. 400 million names at the base of the monument, and inscription read simply, "We remembered, and we returned, and we ensured it would never happen again." Admiral Chun attended the ceremony along with millions of others. who had lost someone in the long years of separation and struggle. She found the name of her youngest daughter, who had died in a mining accident on a frozen moon, and traced the letters with her fingers. Kira Vasquez stood nearby, holding her own daughter, who had been born free and would never know the weight of a collar. The promise was kept, she said softly. Chun nodded and felt something that might have been peace settle into her bones. Yes, it was. Above them, human ships patrolled the stars, not as conquerors or emperors, but as guardians of a promise that the galaxy had learned to believe. And in the dark corners of space, among species who had once thought themselves untouchable, a new saying spread from world to world. Do not enslave the humans, because they always come back, and they bring their friends young Cathvari. Children grew up hearing stories about the Liberation War, and learning that their ancestors had made a terrible mistake by underestimating a species that seemed weak and harmless. The lesson was simple. Strength is not measured in ships or weapons, or years of civilization, and strength is measured in what you are willing to do for the people you love. And by that measure, humanity had proven to be the strongest species in the galaxy. The end.